Well, Rochelle, we are starting with the top headline at this hour. Sam Bankman-Fried could be transferred into U.S. custody after today's expected courtroom hearing in the Bahamas. Kicking off at this hour, the FTX founder faces criminal charges connected to the collapse of the crypto exchange. Bringing Yahoo Finance legal correspondent Alexis Keenan, who is following the details for us. Alexis, what's the very latest?
Hi, Akiko. So Bloomberg and Reuters both reporting that Bankman-Fried yesterday signed surrender documentation that would forego his right to fight extradition from the Bahamas to the U.S. And that in turn triggers a hearing that is supposed to be getting underway right about now in a Bahamas court where Bankman-Fried would be asked to formalize that request. Now, if the judge says that's okay, the FBI would then be expected to be escorting Bankman-Fried back to the U.S. as soon as today. And then by at least tomorrow, we would expect to see Bankman-Fried appear in the Southern District of New York in a federal court for an arraignment where he would be asked to enter eventually a plea of guilty or not guilty. And also he would be getting a bail hearing. Now, the New York Times, they're reporting that Bankman-Fried's lawyers have already been working with federal prosecutors on a bail deal that would include some strict monitoring of Bankman-Fried, like where he can go, where his location, like how far he can travel outside of his home base if he is given the right to remain out of prison. But that decision, ultimately, it's not up to prosecutors. It is up to the judge. And the judge that will be deciding that matter will either be a magistrate judge in the Southern District or the judge who's already been assigned to handle the case. And her name is Ronnie Abrams. Now, the main argument that prosecutors would make against giving bail would be some of the same we would expect, that the Bahamas prosecutors and ultimately the judge decided to deny Bankman-Fried bail in the Bahamas, saying that his vast financial resources made him a flight risk. Now, normally white-collar defendants are offered a chance to remain out of prison pending the outcome of their case, but it is not necessarily required. So this will be up to the judge, and the judge will also be considering things like whether Bankman-Fried is a danger to his community. In this case, and with other white-collar financial fraud defendants, that's usually a no. But she's also going to have to, or the magistrate judge will have to contend with issues of fairness, because oftentimes it's only the wealthy defendants who can afford to put up these large bond amounts.
So then as we look at things like fairness, then how was the bond set for defendants in some of these other high-profile fraud cases?
Yeah, so there's a few white-collar defendants accused of financial fraud that come to mind. A lot of people are talking about Ponzi scheme convict, the late Bernie Madoff. He was granted originally a $10 million bond on claims of $50 billion in financial fraud. Ultimately, Madoff didn't meet those conditions, but the judge granted him a reprieve of sorts and allowed him to have restricted travel and a curfew. Also, Nikola founder Trevor Milton, he was given a $100 million bond to stay out of prison. That's a huge one. And also, we covered so much Theranos founder Elizabeth Holmes, who was convicted of fraud this year. And in January, she was given a $500,000 bond. So this does happen, but I would expect that Bankman-Fried, if he is offered to stay out of prison, that we can expect that number to be probably very high.
Yeah, a lot of money on the table there. Alexis Keenan, I appreciate you tracking the very latest for us. Rochelle, you know, there's a number of headlines we're continuing to track, obviously, in the crypto space as we keep an eye on Sam Bankman-Fried and his extradition, or what is expected to be his extradition to the U.S. We got this news today that Core Scientific, which is one of the largest Bitcoin miners, have filed for bankruptcy. This is a company that was valued at $3 billion as recently as April. And so not necessarily tying it directly to FTX, but as we've seen some of those crypto assets fall, we've seen other dominoes fall as well. And then on the legal side of things, you know, we've seen those who have been holding money within the FTX exchanges, a lawyer representing some of those clients now arguing that they should be held, or they should be defined as custody assets, which means they should get the payout directly and much quicker, as opposed to that getting swept up alongside the rest of the bankruptcy proceedings. So a number of threads here we continue to track in the space, even as we keep a close watch on Sam Bankman-Fried and his very latest move over in the Bahamas.
And you're right. I mean, it really does speak to this issue of how much contagion will there be? How much of this was sort of underlying issues within the crypto industry versus some of these concerns? Obviously, people panicking, not knowing where to put their crypto, where to store it. So, in panicking, sort of pulling out of some of these things. And then you're just left with the last man standing, which is Binance. Binance with its own connections to FTX as well, wondering, will that be next? Or were they the ones who perhaps highlighted most of the issues that led to FTX's downfall? But in terms of even SBF coming for extradition, there was a lot of back and forth as to whether he would even agree to do it. So it'd be interesting to see what perhaps the thought process was in him deciding to go ahead and have the extradition hearing and decide to come. And also what will await him when he does come here. We know that a number of government agencies have their eye on him for some of these fraud and criminal charges, and all of them trying to get a bite at the same apple. So obviously this is something that will take a long time to sort of unwind. And even when it comes to things like figuring out how much bond, we're still not exactly sure where all his wealth is to be able to determine what kind of bond, would be appropriate. So obviously lawmakers have a lot on their hands for sure.